So I stopped the focus on this podcast because I felt that it was extremely important to do whatever was possible to support Kennedy in his independent run for president, given the dire situation that is too obvious to go into any detail about. Although it does seem that there are still many people who don't see it. They don't seem to recognize just how precarious our situation is, not just as a nation, but as a world. But nevertheless, all of that was predicated on the sense that something could be done. And I think I expressed a certain amount of uncertainty about whether or not that was actually the case. And increasingly, I come to believe that there really is not much that can be done. I hope I'm wrong. I know that there are a lot of people who think I'm wrong. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm for the idea that there could be a coalition, this unity coalition between the independent movement and the MAGA movement. I wish I thought that was a good idea, but I don't. I think it's a terrible idea. I think that it could potentially have worked. Well, I'll not speak of it in the past tense yet because we don't know. Maybe it will work. Who knows? But I think it would be far more likely to work if it were anyone other than Trump who was the umbrella under which it was all occurring. I do not see Trump as a genuine actor. I see him as a player in a KFAB professional wrestling game, and I think his job has been and will continue to be the discreditor-in-chief. He will undermine anyone who is associated with him. That's my sense of it. You know, not just by association. I mean, who knows? Who knows what exactly the mechanisms are, the extent to which he's aware of his role. But that is certainly how he functions. And, you know, what everyone on this side of the fence is concerned about is creeping totalitarianism. And that creep is now kind of it's gone past the walk, and I'd say it's starting to jog. And you can feel the jogging, right? Creeping, you can barely notice, right? Walking, it's like, oh, okay, yes, something is going on. Jogging is like it's starting to actually affect you. You can feel the jostle, you know? And then when it really runs and takes off, well, that's when it becomes... I mean, basically, it's beyond the point of any hope of return, and you go through the same kind of contortions that all other totalitarian systems have had, you know, whether that's the communists or the fascists. You know, totalitarianism, the flavors are essentially the same underlying thing. There's a coating on the totalitarian pill. One of them looks far left, the other one looks far right, but they ultimately are the same thing. I mean, after all, the Nazis were socialists, right? National Socialism, that's what Nazi means. And yet they're considered far right. And we see how the Democrat Party was originally thought of as being a leftist-leaning party, but now it has fascist tendencies. And that seems to be the way the pattern plays itself out in civilization. And part of that pattern is the waning power's desperation to hold on to power. But part of it also is infiltration and corruption. And one of the things that's increasingly become clear to me is that corruption is very much like a fruit rotting. And so you can imagine sort of the effort on the part of the fruit that is not yet rotted to stop the rot. But, I mean, come on, really? Is that ever successful? Once the rot has taken hold, isn't it just a matter of time before the whole thing just collapses? And there's just so many different domains within which this rot has taken hold. Economic, academic, the whole drug and alcohol problem, the various forms of mental illness and delusion that are widespread, the psychological domain where there's this epidemic of narcissism and psychopathy at the highest levels, almost as a prerequisite for participating in the highest levels. How do you reform if everyone who's running the show is fundamentally narcissistic and psychopathic? And then you have, various sorts of environmental issues and energy crisis and, geopolitical instability. You have the food stream being poisoned. I mean, I don't want to be a doomer, but it's just like all of these things, they're not figments of one's imagination. All of these things are very real. And so, I felt from the beginning that the Kennedy effort was basically a last-ditch attempt, and while I remain impressed by RFK Jr., and I do believe him to be a man of integrity and good intentions, I think he's proven himself to be easily misled. And perhaps not the best judge of character. I mean, once a guy appears with Rabbi Shmuley saying that they're good friends, that's it's just not a good judge of character. So this leads me back to my roots, in essence, while I think it's still worth remaining engaged on some level civically and politically. I don't think that there's much hope. And so putting a lot of energy towards that really doesn't make any sense anymore. We'll see what happens, right? A lot of people are hoping that somehow or another the Democrats will be defeated and that the Trump administration will provide some solutions to the various problems that I just enumerated upon. And that, of course, was an incomplete list. There's so many other things, too. But, and I certainly am praying that it will work out. But I don't believe it will. I will be happily surprised if we can salvage this turkey. I just don't see it. So returning to a more philosophical and spiritual perspective, the thing that now occupies my mind is how does one deal with the rotting fruit? What is the correct attitude to adopt towards this untenable situation? And, perhaps what is the best model to explain what's happening? And then how do we cope with that? in our own lives? And, is there any potential for us coping with it collectively, or are we sort of all atomized? Because I think that's one of the problems with corruption and, social degradation basically means that everyone is, every man for themselves again. If society disintegrates, then it's the social bonds that have been destroyed, and we're all kind of left to our own devices. Now, is that a inevitability? Is it just the mere idea of that causes this disintegration to happen more rapidly? And is it inevitable? I don't know. But my suspicion is that with each insult to human dignity, so for instance, what's happening now in Ukraine and in the Middle East, the willingness for people to repair and restore good relations is replaced by a desire for revenge. I see that happening not only in war-torn areas, but also just economically, where there's such disparity, such unfairness. When people are treated so unequally, it creates that kind of social degradation, that the fabric of society is ripped asunder by the desire for revenge on the part of those who are quite often rightfully aggrieved and outraged. And I think we see that happening on all sorts of levels here in the United States. The number of people here who have been essentially shunted aside by the system, who have worked incredibly hard and have very little to show for it, and have done really the lion's share of the work in this country. And now all of a sudden their tax dollars are going to people who have entered the country illegally, who are causing chaos, who now are being given a place to live and, vouchers for food and a cell phone, and basically kind of being set up in ways that many of the citizens of this country can't get those kinds of benefits. It's just an outrageous insult. And now you have a situation where, okay, let's be clear, I don't know precisely what's going on, but there is a lot of reporting. Apparently, Mayorkas made a statement saying that FEMA doesn't have enough money to cover the disaster that's happened in North Carolina, that region. And there's apparently a lack of effort on part of the government to reach some of the people in the more remote regions. And there's a whole bunch of other things that may or may not be happening, but this is just such, and they're sending billions of dollars over to Ukraine, and Israel. So our government seems to care an awful lot more about people elsewhere, not the people of this country. And that is a kind of insult that, it's not just a verbal insult. This is something that hits people in their lives in ways that are so visceral. How could anyone blame someone for wanting revenge? Right? It sets up an extremely dangerous situation here in this country. And this is just one example of countless other examples that have happened now. Our country is a tinderbox. And unfortunately, the people who are enfranchised in the system, which is essentially what the Democrats are, right? The Democrats are essentially all the people who work for the government, who work for the corporations, who work for the educational institutions. They have 70% of the nation's wealth, and they don't care at all about anything that's outside of their pre-existing conception. Their narrative that they're fed is the only one acceptable to them. And as soon as you question that narrative, you're essentially a Trump supporter. They just say whatever it is that you question. Their reaction is essentially, "Oh, you must be a Trump supporter," and that to them is equivalent to being someone who supports Hitler. That's how they think of it. And that's why Trump is the wrong guy for a dissident movement of, a unity coalition of dissidents to have as their, let's say, mascot. It couldn't be, that is the wrong guy. Because he's been set up as this figure that let's just call them NPCs. What else are you going to call them? Because they're not willing to have a real conversation. They're not willing to think about any of this stuff. They've just decided that they're, faithful to the narrative. It's the blue church. And that's what whether they believe it or not, that's what they're going with. And in some ways, that's kind of quite impressive. That's what you would want out of a religion. You want people who are faithful to the dogma, irrespective of whether or not it makes sense, so that they will be good soldiers in the field. That's how a functional organization works. You cannot have an organization where everyone has a different opinion. It just doesn't work. And that's why the dissident movement is going to be extremely challenged. Because no one agrees about anything. And without agreement, how can you have a functional organization without consensus? All you can agree on is that the totalitarians are bad. So this leads us to a picture of the world that I will be elucidating over the course of this new season and perhaps final season, because ultimately the Assembly of Silence will end in silence. And I think in many respects the time for conversation is drawing to an end. We failed at the dialectical approach, and things are becoming kinetic. And it's difficult to see how they're going to stop what has already started now in the Middle East from spreading. I don't see how we're not going to see continued escalation. And with continued escalation, it's inevitable that more nations are going to get drawn into the conflict. And, there's probably a very good reason why prophecy saw this kind of a thing occurring. And you could say, well, initially that prophecy may have been talking about other periods of global instability. But in some respects, it doesn't matter whether this is the final act or if it's just one in a series. It's a pattern. And the pattern of nations getting drawn into a kind of clash of the titans is obviously a historical pattern. And we are obviously heading into one such period. And whether it's the final one or not, I can't say. But I am increasingly coming to see that the horror of these clashes is the kind of thing that generated the concept of a savior. And the idea of Mashiach, of the Messiah, is there would be one final battle where everyone would come to agree with one figure, whether they agreed with it because they wanted to or they agreed with it because they were forced to. And that final globalized agreement would end this horrible cycle of bloodshed. But that there was no way we would ever get to that agreement without there being another horrible cycle of bloodshed. And so I don't know whether or not such a thing can actually be fulfilled. It may just be that there will be never-ending cycles of bloodshed, which is what we've experienced to this point. But I can understand why there would be a desire to finally end this horrible cycle, and that in the service of that desire, horrible things would be done. Because horrible things are happening anyway. And so if you can do horrible things that would end the horrible things, if that's what you believe, I could see why people would do some incredibly horrible things in the hopes that it might end all these horrible things. I don't know that that's realistic. I mean, I do believe it's ultimately God's plan that will happen. You know, God's design. And I don't think anyone knows what God's design is. I think the people who are telling you that they know what God has planned for us here, I think, although it's not in the Bible, I think it's probably one of the truest things ever said about God. If you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. I wish that was in the Bible. That would be a great argument against some of the people who are convinced that they know. I think that message is in the Bible. It's obviously clear that there are many passages where the people are crying out, God, why hast thou forsaken me? They thought they knew what God's plan was, but then something else happened. I think that's God's plan, to the best of our knowledge. Whatever it is that we think is going to happen, pretty unlikely that we have it right. Anyway, so I guess we could consider this a relaunching of the Assembly of Silence and various other activities along these lines. I'll be updating my Substack more regularly, and also I have a whole bunch of things to contribute to the Taiji Reality YouTube channel, which is kind of the metaphysical center of what I'm working on. So I'm going to try and release one thing every week. We'll see. And there may be some music in that, because from my way of viewing things, music is the antidote to all of this thinking. Thinking serves a purpose to a point, but then it becomes a liability. It becomes something that will ultimately destroy you if you cannot let go of it. And so I find that the best antidote for thinking is music. It's a way of reintegrating. It's literally, apparently, one of the very few things that you can tell by visually seeing a brain is whether the person was a musician. Because apparently the connective tissue between the hemispheres is more robust in a musician. In a musician who's really practiced music. Which makes sense, because music is a kind of analytical and emotional activity where those two things have to come together. And so the analytical side of it is something which is not happening while you're playing the music. It's happening in the preparation for playing the music. And I very much see philosophy in the same way. It's the work that you do in order to get to the point where you can integrate with reality without having to think about it. So that your instincts are appropriate to the circumstances. So that you don't lose your temper. Tempering is like what you do to steel in order to make it strong. And so that ultimately you really don't have to think about anything, because the structure has already been established and you're in proper alignment. And that's the difference between wisdom and word games. So you could say, in essence, most knowledge is just word games. people define their terms, and then they do various permutations based upon logical principles. This is what Patanjali calls predication. You can't get wisdom from that, because reality does not operate on the basis of rational operations based upon defined terms. That's just abstraction. Reality is something entirely different. Reality is not abstract. The only way we can interact with reality in a cognitive way is through abstraction. But of course, we interact with reality most directly through our physical interactions with it. So if you're chopping wood, that's an interaction with reality. And you will get messages about the degree to which you're doing it properly, based upon how often you're able to successfully split or cut without hurting yourself. That's reality. And there's no abstraction necessary in those kinds of dances with reality. All the various physical activities that are necessary in order to continue life, although of course continuing life is not necessary. But if you're going to continue life, then there are certain necessary things that must be done. And the way in which they're done is a measure of the extent to which one has come into a good relationship with reality. One of the typical measures for that is efficiency. And I'm not 100% convinced that efficiency is a good measure. When I see the way nature operates, there's a dimension of efficiencies involved, but quite often you'll see a lot of energy being expended for reasons that don't apparently make much sense. And my sense of it is that this is part of the learning process. While you're engaging in something, you have an opportunity to kind of see it from a bunch of different angles. So if you're like a cat playing with a mouse, right? The most energy efficient thing to do would be to just kill it, and not waste more energy. But by playing with the mouse, you kind of get a whole bunch of information from one set of interactions with one event, essentially. One engagement. And it's bad news for the mouse, but the cat gets to learn a lot more than if it would just, let's say, jump to the end of the chase. You know, the cat will allow the mouse what seems to be opportunities, but really just another opportunity for the cat to engage in the chase. So I guess you could say, well, yeah, this is a kind of efficiency, but it's an efficiency that has more to do with learning than with the physical act that one is presently engaged in. So that's something I'm going to have to think about a bit more, but I think I've gone on long enough. I think while long form is great, I think it gets a little tiresome, so I'm going to try and make things a little bit more pithy than I normally do. And so with that, I will bid you farewell. If you'd like to support these efforts, it's pretty obvious how to do so. Check for the links in the show note descriptions. And thank you for your attention. Adios.